Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
That makes you feel really empowered. It's a false empowerment because life has a side effect, so no one can give you anything and say it doesn't have side effects. And we don't have the perfect umbrella diet that works for everybody to make them feel younger and more sex drive and think better and lose weight and have more energy yet.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 48, where New York City almost died from a few inches of snow. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Randi Epstein about her book, Aroused, The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. Randi Epstein, MD, MPH, the author of Aroused and Get Me Out, A History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank, is an adjunct professor at Columbia University and a lecturer at Yale University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times and the Psychology Today blog, among others. She lives in New York. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. My name is John Monaster. I am your host. I hope everyone is doing well. I am super excited to be joined today by Randi Epstein, author of Aroused, The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. Randi, how are you doing?
Pretty good today. How are you?
I'm doing well. We were just talking about your crisscrossing the country, so I hope you feel like you're back in one place now.
I am so happy to be back in New York City. I love getting out to the rest of the country, but I love being home in New York, in the crowds, in the fast pace.
In the crowds, being anonymous in the crowds. Cool. So I like to start off with just having the author in your own words, just kind of summarize the book. What's it all about?
Sure. Well, what I like to say, the book is A History of Hormones, as the title says. But really, the point of my book is that I want people to come away with an understanding of what's real and what's some of the marketing hype. Because really, in the last century, there's been tremendous advances in understanding hormones, but there's also been outrageous claims. So while the outrageous claims, I think, make for good/funny stories, the downside is it's really bad health advice that's been touted from the moment we discovered hormones till actually right now in 2018.
Yeah. Always seems to happen. So yeah, I've got some questions I want to get at that point that you raised, because there's certainly a lot of psychology going on here as to why we keep falling for that sort of thing. But before we get into that, I always like to ask about the creative process. I'm always curious about writing, because I can only imagine the monumental effort that goes into putting a book together. So just to start off with, what's your writing process? How did you actually go about, from day one, I want to write this book, to having it published?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll try to make this. It took 5 years, so I won't go through all 5 years.
Okay, the highlights.
But I'll give you the highlights. No, basically, in the beginning, I fish around for just general ideas. I'm very interested in science and society, how they work together and how they clash. So I do a lot of reading. I look into archives. It's sort of a fishing expedition. It's really inefficient in the beginning because I don't know where the good story is. Once I have an idea of what I'm going to write about, I try to get a general outline. Here's what I'm going to look into in each chapter. obviously that can change as I go ahead and do the research. But once I get past all that stuff, there's two things I do. Is one, I really try, and this is hard, to come up um, within a page or just in my head or writing some notes of what's the point of this book. Um, you can't just like, oh, to write about hormones. Like, what is the point? So I try to come up with that sort of kernel of an idea. And then as I'm writing each chapter, I hope that each chapter reflects of that point. But I do each chapter individually. Like, I could never research, and I know friends do this, research an entire book and then write the entire book. I just don't know. I think I'd forget about my research, or I'd lose it, or I'd be like, where's the stuff for chapter one? So then I just take a deep dive into chapter one, and I immerse myself in that, and I write that chapter. I write each chapter at least 15 or 20 times. There's a lot of rewriting. There's a lot of, how to tell the story. I think as I write, I sometimes realize what I'm saying. Even though before I write, I'm like, this is what I want to say in the chapter. As I'm writing, I'm like, oh, maybe that's not it. Oh, maybe, this is what it is. So I rewrite a ton. And I guess the other thing I make myself do is on top of the chapter, I write in large font and bold. I'll write topic. So the topic could be, growth hormone. Story, because people like stories. They don't just want text. I have to have a good story that fits the topic. And then the last part is like, what's the point? I sometimes have trouble answering that question. And if there's no point in telling the story, it shouldn't be told. I mean, usually you do. You just can't articulate it. But as a writer, you better figure out how to articulate.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
There should be a point. So, from all of that, what was the hardest part for you? What's really, where do you struggle when you do this? Or is it all kind of just, it's
The
just
writing.
a grind and you get it to the writing part?
But I mean, it sounds funny, but like I've talked to other writers who feel funny meeting with people or interviewing them, or feel like they're intruding when you talk to a patient. I love that. I love going out and meeting people. I don't mind the loneliness. I wouldn't even call it loneliness, the alone time. I love being in libraries. I love reading. So all of that to me is wonderful. All the reading and researching, meeting people, talking to them, the process of finding who the right person to talk to is. But then, sitting down and writing something, and then the next day looking over and thinking, oh, God, I went on and on too long, or this doesn't make sense. Maybe people will be bored. So I rewrite. I hate the blank page. Yeah, I still get frightened every time there's a blank page.
Right?
Yeah.
That's always very frightening. I remember I used to teach improv comedy kind of in little life, and that was always the hardest part, was creating something from nothing. Once you've got a couple basic ideas, then it's a lot easier in terms of getting people to put themselves somewhere.
Right,
So
absolutely. Yeah, so I would say then, even more to your point, the whole writing process to me isn't painful. Most of it, not the whole part, but going from blank page to putting something down, that's the painful part. That's the hardest part. And then the rewriting, I'm like, okay, at least I have something there.
Yeah. And so you already alluded to this a bit in terms of the connection between science and society, but do you have a direct personal connection to any of this, or what really brought you to hormones specifically in the first place?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have a hormone ailment. I was pregnant. That's hormonal. But I happen to have, for my 4 children, 3 pregnancies. I have twins, easy pregnancies, easy delivery. So I didn't have this mission in terms of like getting back or with doctors of what I went through. But I think from teaching medicine, from going to medical school, from talking to people, what still, I guess, gets my adrenaline going. Oh, and there's a hormone right there. So it still gets my adrenaline going is some of the way that science is misconstrued in the public. And I think I don't know if that's really personal, but it's really my impetus, is that I still see that we like testimony over data. we can't help but fall for marketing. And I see that all around. I see that all around me. So I think that that's a lot of what is really what drives me to write this kind of stuff. I think a lot of it has to do with doctor-patient relationships. And so I worry about that. I worry about the breakdown of doctor-patient relationships, sort of encouraging people to sometimes see other healthcare practitioners that might be closer on the spectrum to charlatan, but those charlatan people offer the comfort that they've been looking for, though bad and sometimes dangerous advice. So that's not really personal, but I would say it's my impetus for writing.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great one. All right, well, let's get into the book, and I want to start off with what may be obvious to some people, but not to others, and that's really just what are hormones. And you make a point at the beginning of the book at differentiating them from your nervous system. So maybe explain that difference.
Sure, and it's actually not an obvious question because I ask, give me a definition of a hormone, and unless I have a group of endocrinologists in the audience, like even other doctors sort of forget. You forget what the definition is, and I think because we tend to think hormones are just a vague kind of thing. Like, I'm hormonal. It just sort of means moody or whatever. And so we don't think it actually is a specific definition. So what I like to say is that your hormones are your internal Wi-Fi. And what I mean by that is the definition of a hormone is a chemical secreted by a gland that hits a faraway target. So not far away like New York City to LA, but far away like brain to ovary, pituitary gland in the brain to testes. And nowadays we think, well, that's no big deal. That's why I think Wi-Fi. Like, I send an email in my house and it goes to a specific target anywhere I want in the world, hopefully without hitting other targets along the way. Or I need a router to get it to go from my house with bad Wi-Fi to get to where it's going. But when the concept of hormones first came out, that was, when the concept of hormones first came out, that was pre-understanding email or Wi-Fi. So in 1905, when these two British scientists said, we have this new way of thinking about these chemicals in the body, the thinking was every message in the body has to travel along nerves. Or we thought messages in the body travel down the blood the way oxygen does. But oxygen is like a raft in a blood vessel, and it just sort of knocks about and is used wherever it wants. The thought that something could come out of the brain and not travel on nerves, travel through the blood, but hit a specific target and not go to the others was really revolutionary and controversial at the time. So, but that is the way hormones work. They are secreted from one gland and they know exactly the target they're going to.
Yeah, and you bring up it being controversial. You write, this book is also a history of the science and a history of the people that were making these discoveries, and you kind of proceed in chronological order, and you talk a bit about the 1800s and early 1900s, and you had this interesting line. You wrote, researchers' most audacious trials allowed science to progress faster than it would today when care is taken to ensure that patients' rights are not violated. So I thought that was interesting and really spoke to a whole different way of science almost. And so I was just curious to know any examples you might have of that, and really if you could speak about, the history of science from that period and how it was different from today.
Absolutely. And I spoke to a lot of people well into their 90s now that told me about how they went ahead and just did science. They wanted to do an experiment. They just did it. They didn't have to ask permission. They didn't have to, go through ethics review boards. And my point is not to say this was the better way to do things. I think science today travels along much more slowly because of ethics review boards, because we have to consider what we're doing to human beings. But that's necessary. I would rather have science go along at a much slower pace, knowing that the people we've experimented on knew what was going on and were treated fairly, versus rush along and learn all this science, except for maybe there were hordes of humans that were taken advantage of. So what was going on? Oh, well, it wasn't always awful things, but we did, when we wanted to test growth hormone in the beginning, we just gave it to children to see if they would grow. It turns out that some of the batches we were using were contaminated with a deadly contagious element in it. We learned 20 years later. I'm not sure if it were slower, if there were ethics review boards, they would have caught on to the contamination. But a lot of what was going on with growth hormone, then we just did it. We were just giving it to kids. Go back before that to Harvey Cushing, who was a pioneering neuroendocrinologist, pioneering neurosurgeon in the 1910s, 1920s. And he had a hunch that something in the pituitary gland made people grow. He was right about that. The pituitary gland, which is in your brain, secretes growth hormone. But so he decided, oh, I'll just get some of those circus dwarfs. We put these people awfully so in the circus, and I'll just give them bits of pituitary and see if they grow. And it worked. But I mean, can you imagine just having a doctor today say, oh, I just want to give a chunk of a brain gland to people and I'm not going to ask anyone and not going to get permission. And this was also the time where people didn't question doctors. They just said, sure, they didn't really have much, they weren't empowered to question what was going on.
Mm. Yeah, and so you mentioned ethics review boards for people. So you also get in a little bit about what happened with animals and animal rights, and there's sort of this brown dog statue story and the animal rights figures. And so how did that happen with early hormonal research, and what happens today? How are animals treated today versus back then?
Well, interestingly, so I would have told you, if I hadn't seen an article today, I would have told you that there's much more. I mean, I do think there's much more care today than there was 100 years ago in terms of animal research, because they have to, because we have laws. But I just read today that there's more monkeys used in research than there has been. Like, it's increasing the amount of monkeys that we use in scientific experiments than there had been in like the last decade. I mean, I was shocked to see that. So, but in general, yeah, because a lot of medicine, not just for animal research, but all of medicine is shaped by patient activism. And I think there's a lesson in that. If you think that something's unfair, you think that there should be more research in a certain area, we need activism. So I do think, though, I'm not against animal experimentation. I do think that some of our greatest feats in medicine, I'd rather have them that it was tested on rats and mice before we tested it on humans. But you're referring to this story in my book called The Brown Dog Affair. And this was some of the very earliest research that really went into figuring out how hormones worked. What I was saying before about, they don't travel along nerves. That research was really done on dogs. And right when these researchers were doing this dog research was right about the time at the turn of the 20th century that there was an uproar over animals used in scientific experiments. And people were really angry, and they worried. There was also a rise of science in the early 1900s. So you had a rise of science, a rise of experiments, and at the same time, a rise of people going, "What is going on in those labs? We have no idea what freaky stuff doctors and scientists are doing." And so people were really angry that they worried about the abuse of animals. In England, they were the first country to pass strict laws in 1876. About what kind of experiments you could do on dogs. You couldn't keep doing it over and over. You had to make sure that they were pain-free. If you couldn't numb the animals enough to make it pain-free because it would hurt the experiment, you had to show proof. I talk about some of the original hormone research was done on animals. And when these doctors went to give a presentation and they had this dog and they cut it open to do this hormone presentation, little did they know that there were two women in the audience who came not to watch the presentation. They came to nab these doctors and say, "Gotcha." So they watched the whole experiment. They published a book called Shambles of Science. And they were at first going to sue the doctors for breaking the British laws, but they were told that there was like hardly a chance they would win this lawsuit. The judges favored the medical establishment, not these activists. So instead, they incited all these protests all over London. Thousands of people came to Trafalgar Square, which is really the center of London. There were marches. There were like puppy dog stuffed animals held in effigy, on poles saying doctors are killing your animals. And a lot of it, the good part is that we do monitor to make sure animals aren't abused, but there was some fake news at the time. I think it was fake, that they were saying doctors were stealing people's pets and using them in scientific experiments. I hate to think that these two University College London scientists that I write about, I don't think they were going into people's homes and nabbing their cute little pets. But that was that was the perception. I mean, that's how much hatred there was between the activists and the doctors.
And I think there's still a lot of that today. I think
Yeah,
you
there
can
is.
definitely find, animal rights activists that push back on what the medical community is doing. So it's an
Oh,
unanswered issue.
absolutely. When I was in medical school, I remember there were protesters outside in terms of, and I do think it's a good thing though. It keeps people on their toes. So,
Yeah.
and I think knowing that there's a potential that somebody could write about the unethical things you're doing, I think it's a good thing to keep people on their toes and to only do the experiments that really are promoting science, that, not just doing it again to make sure that your student got to see it or something.
Yeah. So you briefly mentioned Cushing. So just for a quick sec, I want to talk about him and how important he was and what the what were his biggest discoveries and what did he figure out that no one else did?
Sure. I love talking about Harvey Cushing because he's such kind of an eccentric kind of guy. So just to sum it up, Harvey Cushing was a scientist in the early years of the 1900s. Most people, when they hear his name, if you've heard of him at all, you think of him as one of the first brain surgeons. Obviously there were always people doing stuff like cutting into the brain before that, but Harvey Cushing was known to really be the most effective, meaning that people survived. They actually got off the table after he cut into their brains. So he was really trained as a neurosurgeon, but then he got very fascinated with the pituitary gland. So I like to tell people, and don't do this at home, actually don't even do it out of home, but if you put your finger between your eyes and you just shove it back, you'd eventually touch this little pea-sized gland, and that's your pituitary gland. It's like between your eyes, but back farther. And that pituitary gland, we now know, secretes a lot of hormones that affect our body. Growth hormone, but it also secretes hormones that tell the testes what to do, the ovaries what to do. So it really sort of keeps the body in control. Harvey Cushing just was fascinated with the pituitary gland when we really didn't know much about it. And he was one of the first people that really connected this mind-body concept. So around that time, we had this horrible time in American history where people that were very, very different, really obese, really hairy women, lost a limb, intersex. What did we do? We put them in the circus so that other people could gawk at them. So Harvey Cushing at that time was saying these people aren't freaks and they shouldn't be gawked at. They probably have hormone ailments. And we now know that a lot of people do have hormone issues that made them either too fat or too hairy or too short or too tall. So that was his momentum. And he really started looking into like the people that were the circus giants, saying, let's just not put them in the circus. Let's figure out what is their hormone ailment. And he was right about that. So that's a lot of the studies he did. He was also just like, a crazily ambitious person. Anything he did, he had to do the best. So he thought it was a good idea to draw his operations. So he then studied how to draw under one of the world's greatest medical artists. And Harvey Cushing's drawings, not just of the brain and not just of his operations, but when he would travel, like he would draw pictures of homes in the countryside. I mean, his drawings are like professional drawings. He took a year off to write one book. It won the Pulitzer. He played the piano. He was up there as like a classic pianist. He wasn't a warm and cuddly guy, and he was never going to win Best Dad of the Year award to his 5 kids. But But in terms of his academic and extracurricular accomplishments, he had to be the best at everything he did.
So I'm just curious about why people tend to latch on to hormones as a kind of cure-all or savior. And this seems to happen a lot. Like, there's always some new thing in the news as like, oh, this is now what you guys need to be doing. This is how you need to change your diet. This is what you need to do. And it seems like people are always trying to find the next big thing. And for a lot of people, and you talk about in the book, a lot of people, it's hormones. You know, you have a section in the book where you, I think you like you put hormones under your tongue or something at a somewhere, I think in Santa Monica or something like that, and oxytocin or something under
In
your
it,
tongue to see
in LA, of course.
in LA. Yeah, of course. So yeah, it's just I'm curious to hear your thoughts at that level. You know, why are people's hopes resting on hormones, and why do people's hopes rest on things like that in general anyway?
Oh, it's a great question. I think because one is the more we learn about hormones, the more we learn how they control us. We know that hormones control our moods in ways we're really just understanding. And we know that they control our growth. So, and we know that they control our metabolism. So once we know that, wow, these things control us, I think the next logical thing is, can we control them? And I would say, going back to, if I was going to have a date, I would say 1922 was when we first gave insulin to someone with diabetes, and it worked. They didn't die. We changed diabetes to a death sentence, which it was before 1922, to a chronic ailment. That was a huge change for people with type 1 diabetes. How did we do that? With a hormone. So this really infused a sense of optimism into endocrinology. If we could change what was always considered a death sentence to a chronic illness that you can live with, think of all the other things we could do. So since then, there's been huge optimism. I think that there's many scientists also that are studying what I like to consider these seeds of truth, that we know that oxytocin among rodents fosters mother-baby bonds. At the same time, there's always people that love to grab this low-lying fruit and think, ooh, if oxytocin is necessary for mother-baby bonds among rats, well, doesn't that mean that if I could make a candy and say it has oxytocin in it, maybe people would want to bond with me, like the guy sitting next to me at the bar? You know, you have to think about that. That's a long leap from mother-baby bonding from a rat that just gave birth to grown-up human, different species, in a bar in Brooklyn, trying to take oxytocin and attract the guy next to him. But yes, you actually can go online and buy oxytocin and spray it on you. It could be a spray, it could be a nasal spray, and that's what it's touted to do. So I think that there's savvy marketers, charlatans out there that appreciate how much we really want to control our emotions, our desires, that lure of having a greater libido, the lure of thinking that people can, be hormonally attracted to us. I think it's just irresistible to humans. And this shorty, I think the other part of it is, if you go to a real endocrinologist or urologist or whoever your doctor is, most likely they're going to say to you, okay, if your body is, if you're not feeling well, they might be able to say, here, try this. It may work, but we're not sure. Or you're feeling tired, first try sleeping, then try, all the other stuff. But, if we think that there's something off with your hormones, maybe we'll try something, but beware of this side effect. So then sometimes you walk away a little like, he didn't really say much, or she didn't really help me so much. If you go to your local health guru who's going to charge you a lot more, they give you a certainty sometimes that doctors don't. They will say, go on this diet. It's going to balance your hormones. I guarantee you're going to feel better. here's a supplement. There's no side effects, and here's what it's going to do. That makes you feel really empowered. It's a false empowerment because nothing, I mean, life has a side effect, so no one can give you anything and say it doesn't have side effects. And we don't have the perfect umbrella like diet that works for everybody to make them feel younger and more sex drive and think better and lose weight and have more energy yet. So
Yeah, fair enough. So to get into a little bit to, so we talked, you mentioned briefly some of these, but I want to talk about sex hormones and you mentioned and you talk about Georgiana Jones. So who was she and kind of what did she do to further the science of sex hormones? And then kind of broadly, what was it like working as a woman in her era, and has that changed at all today?
So Georgiana Jones is known mostly for she and her husband created America's first test tube baby. But they did that after they retired. They had full careers and were pretty prominent before that. One of, I think personally, the most amazing thing that Georgiana Jones did, and she was a doctor at Johns Hopkins, is that she and her husband shared a desk for their entire career for 65 years, a partner's desk. So they faced each other on like a big wooden desk. Um, I've been married almost 30 years, 29. And if my husband and I shared a desk, we'd be divorced by lunchtime. So I
Huh.
think it's a major accomplishment for a woman to be married to the same man and share a desk with him for 65 years. And they were besottedly in love. Like, I never met her, but I met her husband and I met the kids. So huge accomplishment there. Go, Georgiana. But what she also did, which I write about in the book, is that as a medical student, she debunked the dogma that said the pregnancy hormone, we didn't have a name, but we knew there must be a hormone that maintains pregnancy. And it was considered that it was in the pituitary gland in the brain because we thought everything was in the pituitary gland. Georgiana Jones, as a medical student, did an experiment to prove these famous researchers wrong and showed that this hormone is in the placenta. We now have this huge appreciation for how complicated the placenta is. It's not just this little sponge that like feeds the baby. It secretes hormones. It knows exactly what the baby needs. But Georgiana's researcher, as a medical student, I keep saying that because I'm so amazed that she did this, led to the current pee on a stick pregnancy test. So she really did the research that led to the take-home pregnancy test. What was it like being a woman? Well, I'll tell you this story, that after she did her experiment and to show that this hormone was secreted by the placenta, her advisor, who really fostered her career, he said, rightly so, if you want to get this published, I wouldn't use your first name. This is 1939, and no esteemed science journal is going to publish something by a woman. So her name was Georgiana Emery Seeger. She wasn't married yet. And I guess fortunately she has a very manly sounding middle name. So she sent off this publication with the name G. Emery Seeger, and she did get a publication. It wasn't easy to be in science then. It wasn't easy to be in science then. I think it's easier now than it was in the 1940s, but I still think that that women are still breaking into what has long been considered an all-boys club. I mean, for Georgiana, it was particularly difficult. There weren't that many women in science and in medicine. When they held a lunch to celebrate her publication, but also some overseas famous researchers were coming to Johns Hopkins, they had this lunch at the University of Maryland Club, and the doctor who was organizing the lunch got a call right before the lunch, and they said, everything's fine with the lunch, but Georgiana Seeger can't come because this is an all-men's club. So even like for one little lunch, so the male doctor organizing the lunch said, well, then we'll just have our meeting elsewhere. And so University of Maryland Club said, okay, they relented and let Georgiana come. So she was the first woman also to have lunch in this all-men's club. She didn't, her husband told me she didn't consider herself a feminist. I think she was a quiet person, compassionate, a very diligent worker, a very, data-driven scientist. And I think from, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, she practiced. I think her view of women's liberation were these women, marching in Washington, D.C. and wreaking havoc. So she actually, though I like to think of her as doing things that feminists would do, enter the medical field and run a department of medicine when hardly any women were. She didn't like to consider herself part of this women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s.
So we've mentioned this word before. You used this word intersex before, and I think you had a really kind of fascinating chapter on intersex people. So I'm just curious to know from you what intersex means and how hormones are involved, and I guess maybe contrasting with transgendered people. I guess people might think that those sound the same somehow or whatever, and really for both groups, how have our attitudes towards them changed over time?
Yeah, I intentionally put the chapter on intersex far away from the chapter on transgender, so that way we wouldn't conflate them as sort of one and the same. I write about intersex, which means people born with ambiguous genitalia. That does not typically look like male or typically look female. We now know that some people that fall into this big umbrella, some of them do need hormones to maintain a hormone balance. Other people, they just are anatomically do not look exactly like a person of their gender, and they don't need any treatment whatsoever. When you look at embryology of what goes on when we go from sperm meets egg, and then, in the beginning, we all look alike. Then we look like a little dinner roll, kind of like a circle. Then we look like a croissant. And then once we hit that croissant phase, there's this spark of hormones. Like one is called anti-Müllerian hormone. And after that phase, like it starts just like within the first month of gestation. And then there's this fork in the road. And typically certain things happen that then start to form male reproductive organs or female reproductive organs. When you look at all the enzymes and chemicals involved to go one path or another, it's more shocking that people look more anatomically alike than, it's more shocking that there's not all this huge range of intersexuality. We know it's much more common than we think. If you lump all intersex together, which could be sometimes includes things like micropenis, a rare case where a penis is very small, or enlarged clitoris, or there's issues with cortisol levels that can affect the way your genitalia looks. If you lump them all together, some of the tallies say it's 1 in 2,000. So it's a lot more common than people think, because you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know that somebody fits on the intersex spectrum. I write about it in the book because what we know about the hormones of gender I wouldn't say gender, the hormones of creating male genitalia and typical female genitalia. I write about it in the book because in the 1950s was a time when there was a huge amount of research into sex, and not sex like sexual intercourse sex, but sex meaning men and women. And we coined the term, someone named John Money, a controversial figure at Johns Hopkins, coined the term gender. So for the first time, doctors were learning that gender isn't if you have an ovary or testy. Gender isn't if you're XX or XY. Gender, they said, is 7 factors. And among them is how you identify. So this is where you could think of, okay, intersex, we had people that didn't look typically male or typically female, but what is their gender identity? How do they consider themselves? Unfortunately, in the 1950s, we weren't saying how do they consider themselves, even though they were talking about it. These decisions were made at birth by doctors. So there were doctors saying, oh, your baby doesn't really have the typical genitalia. We're going to make this baby into a girl. It looks like what might have been like an enlarged clitoris. We'll just cut it off, amputate the whole thing. Yes, this will affect a woman's sex life later on, but good news, 1950s, outwardly they'll look just like all the other girls in the locker room. they'll look normal. There's this push to make everybody look normally female, normally male, which outwardly, as you can imagine, felt successful to the doctors doing it. And maybe some people felt okay with it, but there was a lot of unhappy patients who realized later on in life they learned about the surgeries that were done without their consent when they were much younger. So it's a really controversial time. And that's my intersex chapter. There's still a big intersex movement, anti-surgery, making sure that people respect them and that they're not considered freaks. And one of the things that a woman I became friendly with who identifies as intersex, who is intersex, had said to me, you know, when she saw my chapter, I showed her drafts because I write intimately about her life. I sort of ended on this much more upbeat note that fortunately things have gotten much better since the 1950s. She was concerned that I was being too upbeat and that we still have a ways to go. So there still is intersex activism. At least these people are activists and they're not by themselves feeling depressed and that they're the only people in the world dealing with this. So that's where I get into intersex. Transgender is very different. Transgender does not have to do with that you were born with anything ambiguous. Transgender, we now know that there are people that have anatomically look like one sex outside, or they look like another, but deep down they know what their identity doesn't match their external appearance. So they might have been assigned male at birth because that's exactly what they look like on the outside. But for whatever reason, and we do not know this yet, they truly always identified as a different gender. What do doctors think? Doctors think that during that croissant period I was talking about, you know, when there's a fork in the road and you start to make female genitalia or male genitalia, there's also that same flood of hormones. It taps into the brain. We have all these brain receptors for estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and that things do happen in the brain that form a gender identity. I mean, we can't deny that there's some things that make men feel like men and a woman feels like a woman. Exactly what's going on in the brain then, we don't know. So we can't do any sort of blood test and say, oh, that's right, your brain is more female, even though you look male. So at this point, it's really a lot of talking to people. There are some really compassionate endocrinologists out there working with people and then providing hormones and surgery to hopefully make them feel like a whole person for the first time.
I think that's so interesting that you bring up that idea that there's still a lot we don't know. And, you know, this book is sort of a history of hormones and what we've learned, and we've obviously made huge strides in the last 100 years. I think that's an interesting point that, you know, there's still plenty of medicine, plenty of science to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to say that, I mean, think about it this way. So my grandmother was born in 1900. The word hormone didn't exist. In 1970, my grandmother was diagnosed with a hormone ailment, Addison's disease. That's the same disease that John F. Kennedy had. Their adrenal gland isn't pumping enough cortisone. We now know, and we knew when my grandmother was diagnosed, you can just take cortisone pills. But my point is, my grandmother was born in 1900. The word hormone didn't exist. When my grandmother was diagnosed with this hormone ailment in 1980, we were able to detect her hormone defect and measure her hormone levels down to the billionth of a gram. So that's a lot that went on between 1900 and 1970. I think we're doing I think we've done a tremendous amount of research into hormones in that time period. But there's still a lot to go. I mean, we still are trying to unravel hormones and behavior. We still don't understand a lot of how hormones in the immune system works. We know, for instance, that all the bacteria that line our gut, all those germs, you know, we talk about the microbiome, we know now they secrete hormones, and we know that our hormones affect our microbiome. So what does that mean in terms of obesity and hunger and immunity? So it makes it exciting. It's not to say, oh, wow, we really don't know anything. It's more like, oh, wow, there's so much more to do.
Yeah. And to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, when you were talking about oxytocin, you mentioned this. You had this point which I thought was very interesting, that researchers tend to publish studies with positive results and sometimes ignore the ones with negative results. And maybe that's just because it's more exciting. Like you see the news stories about like, oh, here's this exciting new finding. You're not maybe going to as likely to see a news story that scientists just discovered nothing new, or or something like that. So, but it's a problem, right?
It's a
Or
huge problem.
so how do we get around that when we're trying to do science? What can we do going forward?
Well, I think that science journals need to publish studies, not just say, oh, nothing new, but one, I think it's very important to publish studies that confirm other research. And I've talked to scientists. There's problems along the way. So number one is if you do a study that shows this hormone may help kids with autism, that'll probably, if it's a good study, get published somewhere. That'll definitely get picked up in the press and over and over and over again. If you do a study and that says, oh, what we thought, actually this hormone didn't help these kids, that might get published in a scientific study. It's not going to get picked up in the press. So you're not going to be teaching people, the thought that this hormone does help those kids with autism is still floating around because we haven't promoted the news that actually it hasn't. I also think from scientists saying scientists need to promote their career, and you promote your career by doing new things. You move science along by doing studies that either confirm or don't confirm research that's been done. So if someone says, oh, this hormone does X, it would be a good idea for another lab to do that exact same study and either say, yeah, actually, here's another study that builds on that, or here's another study that says, actually, your study might have been flawed somehow. People don't want to do those confirmatory studies as much because it's not helping their career getting ahead.
Yeah.
It's helping that other guy. So I think that is a problem in terms of society and getting ahead and moving the needle and what gets out and what gets published.
Yeah, and that can cause other problems. So, I mean, and one of these things is, for example, this is kind of touching on many of the points we've raised so far in our psychology and studies showing what's going on. You talk about testosterone. You have a whole chapter on it, but you specifically talk about the testosterone gel industry and kind of what they're up to, and you're a bit critical about them. So maybe just talk about what are the actual facts and what's actually going on there, and why aren't things maybe what they seem?
So here's the facts. We do know that testosterone starts to decline a little bit in men starting at the age of 35. We also know that for some men who are seriously low in testosterone, according to like the way it's measured here in America, which is deciliters per nanogram, in terms of that unit, they like between 300 and 900 is considered the norm. So it's a big window of what's normal. We know if you're below that 300, and we're not even sure if these norms are exactly right, but if you seriously are low in testosterone, either because of injury or illness or disease, obesity can lower your testosterone level. If you take testosterone or raise your testosterone level from super low to in the norm, yes, it will boost your libido, make you less tired, probably make you think more clearly. You have to take those two tests in the morning, and you have to have them read by an accredited lab, because there's actually supplement makers that can test your testosterone for you. And it's, no surprise that if someone's trying to sell you a supplement, when they measure your blood levels, invariably you're going to come out low in something. I mean, they're in the business to sell you something. They're not an accredited lab in a hospital that's just giving you your measurements back. So I'm skeptical, because the way testosterone gels are marketed are like, oh, are you 40 years old and you're tired at the end of the day? Do you come home from work and you just don't really feel like hugging your kids? You'd rather just chill out for a bit. Maybe you have low T and then you need testosterone. Well, I'm thinking maybe you put in a really good day at the office and you're just a little tired. Maybe that. So, yeah, I think that we're just marketing this stuff to very vulnerable people who are thinking, yikes, I am 40 and I am tired. And you mean I can just rub this little gel on me and I'll feel better and boost my libido? Why not? Why not do that? Well, why not? Because everything has side effects, and there's a lawsuit going on now. There's actually 1,000 of them going on now, because testosterone does increase the risk of stroke and heart attack. So you don't want to take any of this stuff if you don't need it. I'm not against taking hormones if you have a deficit. People with diabetes need to take insulin. People who have seriously low growth hormone need to take growth hormone. But I don't think that you should be taking this supplement or taking that one because it's going to boost your libido or make you lose weight. And if anyone ever says to you, don't worry, it doesn't have a side effect, that should be a huge red flag that you're going to the wrong person, because everything has a side effect. You drink too much water, you're going to have to run to the bathroom. That's a side effect.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly.
Fair. You also had a great chapter about menopause, and I learned all the things I never thought to ask about menopause. And the history of it as well, when we're trying to figure out what exactly is going on, and doctors and scientists are trying to create hot flashes, which was just kind of crazy to me. So, what's really going on there? What happens during menopause, and how are hormones involved, and how are they, or can they be used to treat symptoms?
Sure. I mean, we know, unlike in men where there's just like this little, like a steady decline slowly, in women it's more like a bam. At a certain point, your estrogen plummets, your ovaries stop working, and you're not going to have that same estrogen progesterone fluctuation that you had in the past. There's a lot we still don't know, but what we do think is, I mean, it's low estrogen, but we think that there's other hormones involved too. There's research going on now tapping into a specific cell in the brain, and that cell, we think, is related to your temperature control mechanism. So basically, when you're not a menopausal person, we have this temperature control mechanism that our bodies can sort of manage when there's a little uptick of heat around. Our blood vessels change and we can relate. That gets a little screwed up, not even just at menopause, but leading up to menopause is when you really feel it the most, the few years before. So women tend to think of menopause, you stop having your periods, and that's when you feel all wacky. It's usually like 5 years before that, or a few years before, that you're not even thinking you're in menopause. And you may not even realize you're getting a hot flash. We hear hot flash, and if you've never had one, you think, okay, so you're hot, and you just, whatever, you like fan yourself off. It really is like this internal furnace that just makes you feel like there's like this steam from inside, and it makes you feel really claustrophobic. So there are women in their mid to late 40s that think, oh my God, I'm having a panic attack for the first time, not realizing that's a hot flash related to menopause. The changes in estrogen also cause vaginal dryness, can make sexual intercourse hurt. So that's a huge side effect of menopause. And that's really, some women have hot flashes, some don't. The lower estrogen does cause vaginal changes for every woman. It might not bother some women as much as others, but it's there that doctors can measure and see on a pelvic exam. What do we know now? We've gone for like, take hormones after menopause, it's the greatest thing in the world, you're never going to die, it's going to ward off every disease, to don't take them, they're dangerous, stay away. We've sort of come sort of in the middle now. If you've never had breast cancer or a heart attack, if you've had any of those things, you really have to talk. You should always talk to your doctor about hormone replacement therapy anyhow. But what doctors say is for women that don't have a history of breast cancer or heart disease, healthy women going through menopause, if you are really bothered by hot flashes, you can't sleep, as I couldn't. Like I was up every hour, and it seems that's a lot of my friends are going through that. If it's painful intercourse and you're suffering from vaginal dryness, there are now hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And if you've had a hysterectomy, then you only have to take estrogen that you could take in a pill form, vaginal tablet, patches. And many women find relief from this. And there is some research going on looking into non-hormonal mechanisms, but we're not quite there yet.
All right, well, the last question I have is about obesity. And you talk about one of the things that I had previously heard and find really odd and perhaps terrifying is that generally lab animals seem to be getting bigger over time despite being fed the same amount of food. And you could say the same is true for humans, and that there's general trends in terms of obesity. So what are some potential reasons that this is happening? I've heard environmental changes, hormonal shifts. Is there any sort of consensus the science
Yeah,
is coming towards, or are we just still confused?
we're still confused, but we're getting less confused. I write about leptin, and that's the hormone that's secreted by the fat cell. And I want to repeat that the fat cell secretes hormones. I always thought it was just like fat cells were just like, I don't know, a little bit of butter. Like that's what I picture, like an oil droplet. And then, you add them up, you get fat. But actually, they're endocrine secreting cells. They don't just change your metabolism, they affect your hunger. So your hunger drives get all screwed up. So the more we learn about obesity, the more we're learning that it's what compels us to eat is controlled by our hormones as well. Does that mean that you could take leptin shots and feel more full all the time? Not really, because the good news is that the way the human body was made, we were made to survive, and you have to survive by eating. The bad news is that we're learning that we have, I guess, good and bad. We have all these backup systems in ourselves, so that normally if you had some little hormone defect or it was a little too high or too low, that might make you not want to eat. Eventually another hormone will kick in. So don't worry, you'll keep eating. So, the drive to hunger tends not to be a problem for most of us. You might get a little stressed and not feel hungry. You have a meal, you don't feel hungry, but eventually, because our body needs it, you're going to be driven to eat. So that sort of works against a quick fix for obesity. I write about it in the book because I'm fascinated with the way hormones control our drives, not so much metabolism. Yes, they control that. But the interesting thing, what we're learning now is this drive for hunger, what makes us full, what makes us hungry, and how that's affected by our fat cells and how that's affected by the germs that line our gut.
All right. Well, at this point, hopefully everyone listening is well aware that hormones affect everything in our body all over the place. And that was a great discussion. I want to just wrap it up and ask if there's anything else you hope people would get, or any kind of big ideas that you want people to walk away from.
I want people to understand the complexities of hormones. We tend to think of them in silos. Like growth hormone makes you grow. Testosterone does, makes you, people think manly, but women have it too. But they're not. Hormones aren't in each separate silo. It's more like a cobweb would be a better picture in your head, because they're all connected, they're all interrelated. And I really think people, after reading the book, will come away with a more clear view of what's hype and what's real science. And that should hopefully make them make healthier decisions.
Oh, that sounds great. I definitely will. So I'd like to kind of follow up with what other things you might be doing. Do you have a sense of what a next project you might working on? Is there anything else you're doing related to this book, or what's up with you?
Yeah, I'm fishing around for next book ideas. I have some vague notions, definitely along the line of science and society. I'm toying with some ideas about maybe doing something even for like young adult audience, because I think we need science literacy to start at a young age. It would be skinnier book, and it would be more driven by maybe one story, because they definitely won't read it unless there's a really good story involved. So those are sort of the things I'm toying about now. And I'm looking forward to getting back into the classroom in spring semester.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right. Well, let's just do a quick thunder round. I'm going to ask you some quick getting to know you questions, and we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Yep.
Okay. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Okay. food would be either fresh fish or fresh gelato, or both. It could have the
Ooh.
fresh fish, yeah, like a fish and ice cream dinner. But save the ice cream for dessert is a good thing. And drink is
Yes.
easy: a gin martini, up dry, olives, and a twist. And wherever I am, I
Ooh.
like to try the local gin, and I'll drink it even if I actually don't like it. But I love to try gin.
Very generous of you.
Right? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
That's a tough question, because my favorite times are when I have the whole family together, with my husband and 4 kids. Um, I love to be by a lake. I'm kind of a lake addict. I love being by a lake. So we've been to Maine and the Adirondacks. But maybe the most adventurous place that I love being with the kids is we went to Patagonia. Then we were seeing a lot of water, and that was fascinating. It was just absolutely seeing the glaciers up close was fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been to Alaska and kind of went up and saw some of those. It's pretty mind blowing.
Yeah.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
um, I think if I could wave a magic wand and say, I want every single person on the planet to have high quality healthcare and high quality education, then I just think that would solve a lot of our issues, right? We wouldn't have to say, oh, we'd get rid of the climate change debate. We'd have an educated population that would understand the science, that would appreciate it. And I wanted to sprinkle in with my magic wand a little empathy over that too.
Okay.
So yeah, if
fair.
we could have those 3 things.
I like it's a very powerful magic wand.
Right, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Thanks so much. So the book again, Aroused, The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. Randi Hutter Epstein, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much. It's been fun.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.